Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Online Peace Science Colloquium. It's April 30th, 2018. I'm Emily Hencken Ritter, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of California in Merced. And I run the online Peace Science Colloquium for the Peace Science Society International, which is an excellent organization of people studying conflict and peace around the world. And we have this online colloquium in order to share new work in between our meetings and to get excited about new publications and new research as it's happening. Today we have a presentation from Xiaoli, who is a PhD student at Florida State University, and she is going to give us a presentation today. And we also have joining us to discuss the work, Kathleen Cunningham from the University of Maryland at College Park. She's an associate professor of political science there. And we also have Brenton Kenkel, who is an assistant professor of political science at Vanderbilt University, although he's been hanging out at Rochester for the year and will be headed back to Vanderbilt very soon. So we're going to start with a short presentation from Xiaoli on her paper, and then and I would like to remind anybody who's watching that if they're interested, her paper is available, the manuscript is available on the Online Peace Science Colloquium website, so you can check it out yourself and send Xiaoli your comments as you like. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks a lot for having me here. Thank you, Emily, for your invitation and also for coordination. For inviting the discussant, and also thanks for the discussant for coming. So today the paper I'm going to present is Atrocity in Identity, Dynamics of Extremist Groups. The question I ask in this paper is how do the Islamic extremist groups provoke intergroup antagonism and radicalization in society to aid their recruitment? As is shown in this diagram below, after the Islamic extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and IS launched terror attacks in the US and across Europe, Muslim backlash soared globally. In these countries, in the face of looming threat of terrorism, the public and the government most often become increasingly hostile to the Muslim community. And as we can observe, as a response to this aggregated discrimination, the Muslim community has a renewed sense of solidarity and the revival of their identity, and they slow down their pace of assimilation. A widespread concern is that these kind of reactions actually can lead to more radicalization in the Muslim communities and promote the recruitment and the growth of the extremist groups. Now that we are back to the top cell of this diagram, if the extremist group grows stronger, of course, now they can conduct more atrocities. So basically, this is like a vicious circle. And in this paper, I present a game theoretical model to explore under what conditions such a vicious circle emerges. Under what conditions the extremist groups have the incentive to provoke using atrocities, and what policy of the government and the public, and what attribute of the Muslim community possibly may exacerbate the situation and benefit the extremist. I'm going to focus on the intuition of the model. And the first part of the model is about the everyday assimilation of the Muslim community before the extremists conduct atrocities. So an identity like Islam is defined by the combination of descent-based and not descent-based attributes. An identity can be diluted by assimilation. In the case of a Muslim, for example, if he or she intermarries with someone who is not Muslim, or if he or she speaks Arabic or visits a mosque less frequently, he may seem less Islamic in the public's eyes. Assimilation can be beneficial because in-group bias and out-group discrimination are very common. So if a Muslim seems less Islamic, it's possible that the public will discriminate against him or her less. But on the other hand, assimilation is psychologically costly, which is determined by two elements. First is this Muslim's identity consciousness. So to what extent he cares about his identity. And the second is the strength of the identity, which is decided by how many Muslims in this community stay loyal to their identity and do not assimilate. So if we translate this intuition into the model, in this part, the player is the Muslims, and they choose between assimilating or not. Now, their payoff function is given in equation 1. I'm going to skip the details here. But the point I want to make is that based on equation 1, we can solve for a Muslim who is indifferent between assimilating or not. And we denote this Muslim as phi naught. So intuitively, every Muslim who has identity consciousness that is larger than this phi naught do not assimilate because it's just psychologically too costly. And everyone with relatively lower identity consciousness assimilate. And the strength of the Islam identity is given by sigma equals alpha times 1 minus phi naught. So this 1 minus phi naught actually is the proportion of Muslims who do not assimilate. So the more they do not assimilate, the stronger this identity is. And if you can see, there is these two factors are endogenous, determine each other. Now, when we look at this figure below, the horizontal axis of this figure, it represents the indifferent Muslims' identity consciousness, and the vertical circle, the vertical axis, represent the strength of the identity. The curve in this graph will present how does the indifferent Muslims' identity conscious look like given the strength of the identity. And the line will present how does the identity or how does the strength of the identity look like given a certain proportion of Muslims who do not assimilate. I hope I want you to pay attention to this point A. So this point A will present a stable equilibrium. And it is the cutoff point. Every Muslim to the right of this point A do not assimilate because they have higher consciousness. And everyone to the left of point A assimilate. As you can see next, we are going to see how atrocity is going to shift this curve. Now, in this part of the model, I look at how atrocities provoke discrimination from the public and the reactions from the Muslim. From the public perspective, although everyday outgroup discrimination is very common, but most often it is unconscious, subtle, indirect, and ambiguous. However, perceived threat can trigger conscious, explicit, direct, and unambiguous biases against Muslims. Moreover, the specular atrocities can generate both symbolic and realistic threat to the public. And if the Muslims are of low socioeconomy status, which means that they consume more resources or they produce relatively less, and they are of a larger or expanding group size, then these threats looms even larger to the public. Now, from the Muslims' perspective, the aggregated outgroup discrimination from the public spurs reactions from them. They tend to provide more in-group favorism so that they can maintain their in-group cohesion or protect their in-group sacred values. And this in-group favorism can be some kind of material interest or some type of moral support, for example, consolation, reassurance, or a sense of belonging and security. Now, if we translate this into the model, we can see that the Muslims' post-atrocity payoff is given by equation 2. And based on this new payoff function, we can shuffle the Muslim who is indifferent between assimilating or not after atrocities are committed. So we denote it as 2 phi naught. As you can see, this one is different from what we have previously due to this part, this H, because the difference has been caused by atrocity. This part is the aggregated discrimination, and this part is the reaction from the Muslim community, and this is the aggregated discrimination. So we want to see that how the extremists want to shift this curve based on that atrocity is going to work this way, to change the indifferent member. So what do the extremist groups want? They want radicalization in the Muslim community. They want to promote their recruitment. So radicalization is a process of gradually converting to the extremist violent ideology, espousing terrorism. The extent studies show that personal crisis relating to one's identity management is critical to the conversion. And moreover, Muslims of high identity consciousness and who do not assimilate are more likely to experience this kind of identity-related issue, contribute to radicalization. So the extremist group benefits from a larger pool of loyal Muslims who do not assimilate, and they can achieve this by provocation. But provocation itself is costly. So as a result, the extremists only apply provocation if their gains from recruitment outweigh the cost of implementing atrocities. Now, in this part, the player is the extremist group, and they choose to provoke or not. The payoff function is given by equation 3. And based on equation 3, the point I want to make here is that we can figure out, we can have a condition, this one for provocation. So the meaning of this condition actually is that the extremist group only provoke if they are able to induce a sufficient proportion of Muslims who stop assimilating. So this delta phi naught is the proportion of Muslims who stop assimilating. We call it provocation efficacy. If we look at this figure below, now this black curve is what we have previously, before atrocity are committed. And the extremists want to push this curve to the left. Now that we have a new curve, the blue one, this one is what we have after atrocities are committed. And now we have a new intersection. And based on this new intersection, everyone to the right of this point do not assimilate. And compared to what we have previously, the horizontal difference between these two intersections is this delta phi naught. And we just said that this delta phi naught is the increase of Muslims who do not assimilate. And only when this increase is big enough, they provoke, because then they can compensate for the cost of provocation. Now, this is the setup of the basic model. And now I will move to the results very quickly. There are two indices, two focus that I want to talk about. First is the threshold of Muslim reaction that enable provocation. And the second is this delta phi naught that we just talked about, is the efficacy of provocation. And the first result I find that is that the extremists only apply the provocation strategy if the Muslims' reaction to the public backlash reaches a certain threshold, tilde lambda. So we obtain this result by solving the condition of provocation that we just showed a minute ago. And this result is very intuitive, very straightforward, and it serves as the benchmark result. So the implication of this result is just intergroup backlash and reaction are essential for provocation to work. So Muslim reaction actually is an integrated part of this vicious circle. And the second finding is that if the Muslims are unproductive and the everyday discrimination against them is severe, as the Muslim community grows larger, provocation becomes more efficient and the extremist payoff becomes higher. Otherwise, the relation is undetermined. So the implication of this one is like the Muslims' productivity actually help to reduce provocation efficacy, and their consumption increases. So because if they consume more, they actually inspire more outgroup discrimination out there. Now, I quickly look at a modification of this model. In this part, I want to explore an alternative public policy that the public not only discriminate, but also exclude Muslims after provocation. And the Muslims post-atrocity payoff is given by equation 5. Particularly, this beta here, it is the probability of a Muslim interacting with another Muslim. It measures the degree of exclusion. If beta is of a higher value, it means that the degree of exclusion is also higher. And based on this modification, proposition 3, the threshold of Muslim reaction is lower and easier to meet when the public both exclude and discriminate the Muslims, compared with when they only discriminate. As the degree of exclusion rises, provocation efficacy and extremist payoff both increase. So the implication, the message here is very clear. Exclusion generally worsens the situation. At last, we quickly look at another modification. Here, I want to explore how the Muslim community's extremism and heterogeneity affect the results. I adjust the Muslim community's range of identity consciousness, this phi, and here X measures the Muslim community's mean of identity consciousness. If X is higher, then overall the community is more extreme. And mu measures their heterogeneity. Also, a higher value of mu means that they are more heterogeneous. I have two findings here, both of which are counterintuitive. So proposition 4, the threshold of Muslim reaction gets larger and more difficult to meet as the Muslim community becomes more extreme or more homogeneous. And proposition 5, provocation efficacy decreases in the Muslims' extremism and has an indeterminate relation with the Muslims' heterogeneity. So the implication is that Muslim extremism and homogeneity do not necessarily benefit the extremists regarding provocation. This is kind of counterintuitive. Now we come to the conclusion. I want to highlight these 4 points we just talked about. First, intergroup backlash reaction is essential for provocation to work. Muslim reaction is an integrated part of the vicious circle. Second, Muslims' productivity reduces and their consumption increases provocation efficacy. Third, exclusion of Muslims generally exacerbates the situation. And last, Muslim extremism and homogeneity do not necessarily benefit the extremists regarding provocation. Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to stop here and I look forward to your comment.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, we'll open it up to comments from our discussants. Perfect timing, by the way, that was excellent. Okay, Brenton?
So I thought this was a very interesting paper. I guess, so to just kind of, to start with what, I guess to kick off the discussion. So I thought the most interesting idea in the paper was one that maybe you buried a little bit. Like I didn't feel like I caught this until kind of like one of those last extensions about like excluding Muslims, was that what really determines provocation here is not like the underlying sympathy or lack of sympathy for extreme causes, but kind of like how much difference provocation actually makes to behavior, right? Yeah. And so it's I mean, it reminded me, like in formal model terms, it reminded me of sort of this like the logic of like pivotality in voting models, for example, right? That so that basically the extremists only care to do provocation in so much as it affects people's behavior. And so one way for the government then, or for the majority group, to deter these sort of provocative attacks is in essence to like create space for people to differentiate themselves, right? Because if the minority is already inclined to differentiate and feels secure doing that in the absence of provocation, then there's no incentive to engage in provocation. And I thought that was an interesting dynamic. And then I seeing that made me think I'd like to see more kind of about like the majority group's welfare and the majority group's choices in the context here, right? That kind of like you do a good job nailing down the strategic interplay between the extremists and the minority group, but I think that there's a lot to say about how that interplay in turn affects the majority's incentives and choices.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, because the majority, I mean, the public here, actually, it's not, I mean, in the strictly speaking, it is not an actor, because they don't choose their action like is programmed. They always like react, they will, I mean, aggregate, I mean, make a discrimination even worse once atrocities appear. So I agree with you. I mean, another perspective actually is to talk about that's more like a solution, what the public can do so that I make a provocation less efficient, effective.
Kathleen.
So I had a very similar comment to Brenton, which, although in less formal terms, which was the idea that you're modeling it as heterogeneity, but you can think about it as swing voters. So this is exactly the same kind of thinking, is that you have populations in which the provocation is going to do something and ones that it's not going to do anything for. So I think that's, just to second that, is a great idea to think a little bit more about it that way, and to maybe link it to some of the other things that we already know about situations where you have heterogeneous populations, or swing voters, people that can be influenced in certain ways. I have two other related comments that I wanted to bring up and hear your thoughts on, and Brenton and Emily's. The first relates to time, and the second is to understanding your view of the recruitment process. And I think you have worked to offer this as a general model because you're formalizing, and I know you're starting with the case of Muslims, but you've indicated that you want this to be more generalizable. And I think what then is missing from this is the idea that we already know some about how recruitment works. Right? So we have models of recruitment like from Weinstein and from Scott Gates, and there are specific things that they and others see as going into the process of getting individuals to come on board with a kind of political behavior or cause. So one question would be sort of, do you need to understand recruitment as part of this? Because that is what you're talking about, is the pool of people available to radicalize. And do you think about it as fundamentally different from rebel recruitment, which is what those two authors that I highlighted are talking about? So that's sort of a question I think needs to be posed. And then the second piece of this is just about time, right? You have a process that requires time. You've identified this as something that takes time, but then that's not always clear in the model how that happens and the rate at which responses are observed or sort of taken up as processed information. So you have some situation where people could be provoked. You provoke the response. You need time for the response to happen. And you're talking about discrimination and exclusion, which I think could be defined a little better. And then you need people to decide or maintain a non-assimilationist sort of policy on their own. And then that information kind of goes back to the extremists. So I thought it'd be interesting to hear you talk a little bit more about how quickly is all of this happening? Is radicalization really a slow process, or does that speed vary? And sort of put this in a little bit more context for recruitment models and how we think about the temporal flow of the argument.
Yeah. So about the recruitment, I mean, like this kind of provocation recruitment, how does it differ from like a rebel recruitment? I think the point I want to emphasize here, that is necessary, true. I mean, in rebel recruitment is that it's like there is some behavioral, I mean, things going on. So you just shock the audience with this kind of atrocity. I mean, with this spectacular atrocities that like, cutting off their head, massive shooting and this kind of stuff, then naturally they can, provoke reaction from the audience. So I think this is not necessarily true in the rebel, recruitment. So I think these elements are kind of quite unique in the, terrorism recruitment. So the mechanism that I'm talking about here. But of course, it's not reflected, in all the details of the model. I think this is the thought that, behind the intuition, behind the model, how it happens. But if you ask me, what is the, what is the parameter in the model that represent this kind of, mechanism, I would say that, well, actually, I honestly say that I don't have that, but I think this is how it happened, that different from rebel recruitment. And also, the other point is, sorry, what's the second question? I a little bit missed.
Yeah, so the second one is about time, the time that it all these things happen.
So the time, and also there is actually not a time frame, in the model. So I didn't talk about like a first period and then a second period or what. And I think there is a sequence of, actions and reaction in this model, but there is not a time frame, for example, which step is longer than the second step, than the other step and all those stuff. I don't have comparative, like the time in the model. I think that we can understand it as I mean, some part like the provocation part, the terror attacks, it may happen in a shorter time frame, and then maybe people's, I mean, respond to that. I mean, radicalization is gradually, I mean, happening gradually. I mean, after a lot of this terrorism, after I experience a lot of discrimination from these people, from the public, then I gradually convert to, I mean, radicalization. I think that's one type of understanding. But of course, I also want to say that how do people radicalize? This is a question that I think no one can give a determined, I mean, answer. No one can explain why. Is it economy, psychology, or whatever it is? We still don't know it. So I think the mechanism, actually, I cannot look at more and I mean, like try to figure it out.
So if you guys don't mind, let me just follow up on that response. Thank you. I will say, I mean, I think I'm less interested in seeing like the timing in terms of the phases of argument or or sort of stages in the model, but just the idea that if you're modeling the choice based on perceptions of behavior, I think you have to speak to the time that it's going to take. So if I blow something up and I'm looking to provoke discrimination, well, a lot of the discrimination we're interested in is pretty systemic and long-running, right? It's not necessarily, I think it would be different to say, you know, provoking like direct attacks on civilians or things like this. So I think it's just something that you would need to consider eventually in the model, or even in just your, you know, sort of interpretation of the findings, right? That those temporal sequencing really does matter for your argument.
Yeah, I agree. I think this actually would be a very interesting feature if I can, I mean, build it into the model. For example, a more dynamics, I mean, process. For example, if you provoke once and then they have some reaction, and then you provoke again, and does the effect is it exactly the same, or does that effect actually fade? I mean, become stronger or weaker? I think as time passes by, maybe the mechanism will change a little bit. It will be very interesting if I can build that, I mean, into the model. That I absolutely agree that time actually is an important factor here.
Brenton.
Can I piggyback a little bit? So, I mean, so something, I mean, I think this is related to Kathleen's thoughts. I mean, one of the things that struck me about the model is that basically all that the sort of the extremist group wants is more loyalty based or less assimilation, right? That's like their like direct objective. And I mean, so usually, at least in my understanding of these like strategic theories of terrorism, what's usually it's more the case that what the extremists want is some kind of like policy concession, right? Yeah. And so I thought it was quite interesting that what the extremists want here is a little bit different, and that it's almost this sort of cultural thing, right? But I do think it raises these questions of observability, right? That how do they actually know that they've achieved their goal, right? If it's because if they only know because of, you know, like because down the line, you know, the less people assimilate, that results in a change in policy or something, that's not, maybe that doesn't result in your model being so distinct. But if there's some sort of cue or something that these groups can look for to see that they've successfully prevented assimilation, I think that would be really interesting just to talk about in how you set up the model, not in terms of extending it or anything, just like sort of saying like, this is how the extremist group actually knows what their payoff is, in a sense.
Yeah, I agree with you. I saw some sources. I don't remember where it come from, but they distinguish two types of goals of the extremists. One is that like this kind of provocation. Another actually is a policy-oriented, strategy. So sometimes they want to attack the system, but sometimes they don't. So actually there is some underlying tension between these two goals. I want to make the story a little bit cleaner, so I didn't incorporate the policy goal here. But I agree with you that if I build that in and then made the extremists to trade off between these two goals. Sometimes it's not that you blow everything, then the government is going to listen to you. Maybe you sometimes even need to restrain yourself for bargaining with the government. So I think that would be interesting. Compromise that making by the extremists and trade-off that they made. I didn't build it in here. So so that I want to focus on the recruitment story here. That's why I didn't bring that in for the moment.
Brenton, you want to follow up on that? Oh, okay. Kathleen.
Yeah, let me just introduce another question or comment that I had. In your model, extremists are sort of a predetermined actor. And I think that is probably fine from a modeling perspective, but I think from a broader theoretical perspective and empirically, it's problematic. So I would direct you towards Wendy Perlman's work on this, her book on the Palestinian movement and her article that essentially show that what the behavior we think of as extremist or the behavior of extremists is endogenously defined by the processes that they're going through. And I think because you have already defined these endogenous sort of relationships, it's worth giving some thought as to why you see there being this actor that's totally outside of that to some degree. So it may be that you just want to say, this applies to cases where you have a defined movement that's outside of the general population. But if you're looking more broadly at like social movement processes or contention, I think it's problematic to say, here are extremists. They want more people to be like them, when extremist is sort of not really defined in reference to anything.
Could you illustrate like another, like a couple of other goals that maybe I can use in the future, except for this recruitment, or maybe something else that I can build in the model? But I definitely agree with you that this is a very, very focused story, because I don't want to but honestly, I also want to go through the review process, because people always tell me so I want to provide less material for them to criticize me, and then otherwise they would talk about this or that literature, and that's also one concern.
Yeah, I think this can be alleviated by making very clear the bounds of what you're talking about. And in the current draft of the paper, you're doing that more or less through saying Muslim assimilation post 9/11, right? So you are really speaking to a very clear historical point in time. I don't think that your goal ultimately is to just explain that case. I didn't get that sense from the paper, but then when you move away from that, you really do have to engage with the idea that there isn't always an extremist sitting on the outside of a political process, right? And that you would have to be able to identify these actors ex ante. So I would just give that a little bit of thought. How would you, whether or not you ever wanted to collect data on this, but how would you empirically identify who are the extremists and who are the population that they're speaking to? And sort of think, if you were going to generalize, how would those things be identified?
Yeah, I think this actually is interesting. I would like to, at some point, if have a better identification and measurement about this project, I definitely would like to collect data and do empirical work to test whether it is, really, plausible. And I think there is one paper about terrorism that I put it aside for a very long time. But at that paper, I look at a different, like terrorist groups, their claim and what they aim for. So I put them into 5 or 6 categories. So some of them are more religious oriented, and some of those that they claim that we want our territory, we want to share power, and some of those like just like underdogs in their country, so no one pay attention to them, and they just like we just want basic rights of our to live on and those stuff. And then I kind of text different groups, how do they, if they have different goals, different aims, how does it affect the chance of terrorism? And interestingly, actually, some of those have lower chances, some have higher chances. According to my I remember is that like religions and those who I think religion is definitely one of it, that it actually increased the chance of terrorism. But some of those that they want to share power, they want to say that we want to have a party and then we want to have an election. Those kind of groups, the existence of these kind of groups, they decrease the chance of terrorism. So I totally agree that if the groups have different, different emphasis, what they want, that probably sometimes they do more or less of this. They do not always provoke or what. I think I can link this paper to that, but it is still quite different. I think this, if I want to test it, I still have to identify a measure. I may have much better identification and measurement.
Brenton, do you have anything?
I've been trying to think through. I'm again thinking back to one of the things I said earlier, kind of focusing on the sort of more on the majority group's behavior, which is totally black boxed here.
Yeah.
I think that would be interesting in combination of this question of kind of when does an extremist group emerge at all, right? That like I guess this might be a comment more directed at future work than revisions of this paper, because I don't want to say like add the whole kitchen sink to this model, right? But if you wanted to think about how these groups emerge, I do think like basically looking at the sort of the conditions for majority group behavior and like maybe this this exclusion parameter, right? It could actually be a kind of interesting trade-off for the majority, where on the one hand, if they create a lot of space for the minority group to differentiate itself, that reduces the payoff to extremists to operate. But maybe it also, by letting this sort of more like inwardly focused group that doesn't interact with the majority as much to take place, that also creates conditions for an extremist group to emerge, right? So I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but I do think that those two questions could combine with each other in an interesting way.
Oh, I guess there are actually two papers out there already talking about this question by Melly and Siegel, 2017, and another one is a manuscript. So they look at how much they want to, assimilate, and then, in the face of repression, the risk of repression from the state is somewhat similar to what you're talking about. And my paper also actually somewhat, to some extent, inspired by that two paper as well. Yeah, I think I can think of, because they didn't talk much about like a recruitment, provocation. That is not the point that we're talking about. Maybe I can find an angle, find a link that between these two, then I'll make a new paper.
Kathleen.
Yeah, so I want to bring up two assumptions of the model and sort of ask you a little bit to defend them now, but also in revising the paper. I think you need to focus on these. One is that repression leads to solidarity. There's a debate in the literature and conflict about the effects of repression on cohesion. And so you should engage a little bit with this debate. One stream says repression can sort of undermine movements or groups because they have typically uneven costs across the people that are sort of being repressed. And the other would see this as motivating more people to come together in sort of the solidarity style argument that you're making. So I think you would need to justify your assumption that repression or discrimination and exclusion, as you're describing it, would actually lead to solidarity. And I think you could tell an alternative story about people deciding to assimilate faster because they were scared about the consequences of differentiation. So having that be at the forefront of your assumptions that you're defending. And then the second is the cost of assimilation, which I thought was a really interesting part of the model. And here you have a positive cost of assimilation in that you are sort of, as an individual, losing something. And there are benefits to assimilation as well. But another way to think about this would be sort of group costs versus individual costs and the trade-off that people are making as community members. And so I could see this playing out in a number of different ways, but I think in the paper, you just need to be a little bit clearer on how these happen. So you're identifying a psychological cost, but I think it would be equally likely that you would basically just be punished by your group, right, for assimilating. So I think this is more commonly the story, particularly for young women, right, as they try to assimilate with the majority population. Their family and their community will try to stop them from doing it. So it's not the psychological cost they're paying. It's a real cost that comes from their group and their family, not from, losing their psychic benefits of groupness, which is sort of a very abstract way of thinking about it. So I think that may be worth thinking a little bit more about as you develop the model and make those strong claims about both the effects of this this sort of behavior that gets provoked, the backlash towards community, and also the costs and benefits of moving away from that community in terms of assimilation.
Yeah, I agree with you. So for the first point that repression can lead to, two directions. I didn't, highlight this point. I think there is one thing that that is actually related to this point, because I have this lambda. It is a threshold of a minority group, Muslim reaction. And I only look at the situation where this threshold indeed is met. If it is not met, then we don't need to talk about this story. But I think actually the part that I didn't talk about, didn't explore much, as you said, actually could be very interesting, is that some groups, why do they generate so much, in group favorism in the face of algorithm discrimination? But some of those actually, they don't, when there's threats coming out there, maybe the best way for me to is just to assimilate, and some of those groups, they disappear in history and they don't exist anymore. So it's not that every identity can preserve, in the history, some of just don't exist anymore. But I didn't, explore, much of the mechanism behind why they sometimes generate so much, in group favorism, that in the face of repression, then we get together. But sometimes we don't. I think I really need more, historical knowledge and more empirical, knowledge to feel these links. Instead of just making an assumption out there. So the other is that the cost of assimilation. So for the sake of this story, I model it as a psychological cost. But I think I have a footnote also, in the paper, that it won't be problematic if you interpret it as material cost. For example, some people, their appearance or their learning new language and behaving like the others, like the outgroup members, it is just maybe not that costly for them. They learn very fast, and I just behave like someone that not in my group anymore. But some of those that maybe they just learn very, very slowly, they can never assimilate, to the public. So this kind also can be the cost of assimilation, the ability of passing or the ability of learning. I think that could be, for making this story, I called it psychological, cost. But I agree that it can be interpreted as other cost. And of course, I didn't talk about the angle that you just provide, that the minority group that discipline those who betray the group, that we punish you. Then I think I will need to introduce a new actor, that why do this group have this incentive for what they want, and when do they punish and those stuff, then but this could be an interesting, look at the mechanism, the underlying, this story, that why it happens in particular this way but not another way.
So I actually think, so one of the things that I was a little bit confused about in the model was why we have this like coordination game type structure where my strength of identity is a function of other people's identification choices. And I actually think that the punishment by other group members story would be a pretty good fit for that assumption, right? That like if I'm like assimilating and so is everyone else, then we can all kind of jump together, right? But if I'm assimilating and no one else is, then I'm subject to potentially, quite high punishment from my social circle, right? And so I don't think that you would need to actually like necessarily introduce that as an explicit thing that happens in the model, but you could just sort of motivate what you have here as a sort of reduced form of this longer punishment process. I think that would actually be a cleaner way to motivate that than what you currently have.
I also agree with this point. Actually, I think I can at least add a footnote about that. Why do they, if there are more of them out there that do not assimilate, the strength of the identity is stronger. Actually, the point you just bring, that if there are a lot of us, then the chance of being discovered and get punished actually is lower. But if you yourself stand out and everyone else, stick to the group, that it's very easy to discover you and then punish you. I think this is another way. It's a very interesting way to talk about. I definitely will add a footnote. To the strengths that there's an alternative way of understanding. The strength of the identity.
Let me just add to that. I actually think it's more than an alternative, because if it's harder for me to assimilate because my group is punishing me, that creates a fertile environment for the extremist actor to engage in this strategy, because I can't avoid the targeting that's going to happen, right? So I think it's actually meaningful for your argument about why extremists would use this, or under what conditions they would use this, because they can have more confidence that the backlash is going to hit their community the way that they want it to, right? So if I can't pass as not being part of my group because I have to dress a certain way, or I'm not able to speak a different language, then that makes it more beneficial to use this kind of strategy in the first place. And so it's not just an alternative to psychological cost. It actually impacts this utility of the main thing I think you're trying to explain.
Yeah, I'm going to add this argument. I agree with that. Actually, the extremists we observe, the chance, how easy they're going to assimilate, and those stuff, the cost, if you can induce a lot of them that, based on the punishment, then of course they're going to more likely to do it. If not, then the other way. I think this is actually coherent, connected with each other. I'm going to add this to the footnote, and also, make the argument richer, from this perspective.
It might be worth looking at just some of the, and I don't have citations for this, I'm sorry, but some of the historical writings on assimilation in America. I always just think of family example, but my family came from Ireland, and for a while that was a really big deal. And now it basically only matters in March, right? And so the assimilation process for lots of communities in the US sort of followed these paths of greater or lesser ease. I think it would bolster the argument if you could sort of back it up, not just with, citations about what people say about backlash or discrimination, but what does a path of easy assimilation look like if that exists? What does it look like if it's harder? What if it gets halted? So, you don't have to necessarily get the data from Muslim community, but you could think about this in a broader context, and you have a place where lots of communities assimilated to varying degrees.
I think this question I think it's very interesting. It should be an independent paper looking at why different groups have different process or different speed of assimilation. I think this actually should be another paper. Very, very interesting.
Do either of you have any last comments that you would like to add before we sign off? You guys have been stars. I would like to thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Xiaoli, for sharing your paper with us and your presentation. And again, I would like to encourage anybody who's watching to check out the paper. It's on the online Peace Science Colloquium website. And thank you so much to Kathleen Cunningham and Brenton Kenkel for joining us and reading the paper closely and giving excellent feedback to Xiaoli. And the very last online Peace Science Colloquium meeting for this academic year is next week, next Monday, same bat time at 11 o'clock Pacific and 1 o'clock Central Time next week, May 7th. And Katie Webster will be presenting her paper, and Katie won the Bremer Award for the best graduate student paper presented at the Peace Science the Peace Science annual meeting back in November. So she's going to be presenting that paper. So hopefully everyone will be able to join us. Thank you very much for your time today, guys.
Thank you so much.